Nutrition fuels our bodies and minds. Our strength, mobility, energy, and even mood rely on the right nutrition, and scientists are continually uncovering new secrets. Welcome to Nutrition Unlocked, the podcast celebrating innovations advancing the role of nutrition and health, sponsored by Nestlé Health Science. In each episode, we talk to experts from around the world about the latest topics in health science. We'll bring you insights and discuss innovations that are unlocking healthier futures.
Welcome back to Nutrition Unlocked. I'm Anna Mohl, your host for this episode. In today's episode, we're going to chat about nutrition in women, and I'm excited to say we have a brilliant guest joining us, Professor Louise Burke. She is a sports dietitian with 40 years of experience in the education and counseling of elite athletes. She worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for 30 years, first as head of sports nutrition and then as chief of nutrition strategy. She was also the team dietitian for the Australian Olympic teams for the 1996 through 2012 Summer Olympic Games. Hi, Louise. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. You have a very impressive and very interesting experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear your story of how you ended up not only working in this area, but how you became such a renowned expert.
Oh, you're very kind. It is an interesting story because when I was at university, I really had no idea what I wanted to be. And I stumbled across nutrition by accident. And I didn't even know there was such a thing as a dietitian, but I started studying nutrition. And then as I got closer to going into the dietetic component of it, I met one of my lecturers at a social occasion, and I noticed that he wasn't really eating what was on the menu. He was just eating lettuce and cheese. And I asked him, what's the problem with the food? And he told me that he was a marathon runner and that he was about to do an event on the weekend, and he was doing a carbohydrate loading protocol, new from the Scandinavians. So this is back in the 1980s. And he was explaining to me about how you could change the glycogen levels in your muscles in a low carbohydrate diet and then switching to a couple of days of high carbohydrate eating. And that was going to fuel him for the marathon. Well, the light bulbs just went off in my mind. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to work in this area of nutrition applied to sport because sport was my passion. And there was no such career pathway at that time, so I had to make it up. But I've really enjoyed so many wonderful adventures and so many opportunities to work with some fascinating people. And I've gone through my life being a bit of a practitioner, a bit of an educator, and a bit of a researcher. And I'm going to close out my career as the research part, but always connected to the application of how we can help people improve their lives, improve their fitness and their health through nutrition.
It's funny how a sort of a happenstance event can make such a decision become so obvious, and how everything came together. So did he win the marathon? Do you know? Did he make a good time?
No, he was just a recreational person, but because he was interested in nutrition, he was reading all the stuff that was coming out, and he found that this new field of sports nutrition was gaining a bit of traction. And he was starting to practice it. Well, of course, the first thing I did was I wrote to my football club because I'm a mad Australian rules football following person. I thought this is going to win them that premiership because the team that I follow is hopeless. Our football league has been going for 125 years and my team has won the premiership once. So I wrote to the football club and said, this is the missing thing. You've got to get nutrition into your program. And I wrote to this famous player who would have been like a David Beckham, like he would have got thousands of letters a week from girls. And he read mine and he passed it on to the club doctor who invited me to come down. And so all my career has been just a whole lot of those serendipitous moments where people have taken a punt and been very generous with giving me an opportunity. And so that's, something, I guess, for young people out there listening, that there's going to be all these great things that happen in your life you weren't counting on. And when you get to the end of it, you look back and it'll all make sense. But always keep striving for something new and exciting.
I think that's a great lesson at any age, actually. Now, you've done a lot of unique research around female nutrition and how it impacts athletic performance. But maybe let's start something a bit simpler, maybe a bit more foundational for many women. And that's starting back at puberty. Can you please share some insights on how puberty and menstrual periods affect women's nutritional needs?
Well, look, there's a couple of different things that we can think about. And women are really tricky beasts because we have a different hormonal pattern to males, and ours changes over our life. And it changes when we go through puberty first to establish that regular menstrual cycle. And then over those menstrual cycles, it changes within the cycle. And some of us go on oral contraceptives and some of us become amenorrheic. And so there's all sorts of different ways that we have our hormonal background happening over our life. And then sometime, that happened for me about 10 years ago, you then stop and you go through menopause and then it changes again. So there's a very complicated set of hormones that are continually changing and are different between women and within women over their lifetime. And that's one of the things that happens. It changes some of the way that we metabolize nutrients. It changes some of our nutrient requirements indirectly because obviously when you're having a menstrual cycle and you're having that menstrual bleed, you're losing some iron. And so a female's iron requirements increase. And we've got to think about those special needs from the physiological angle. But I think the other thing that people don't think about so much is what's happening to us socially and culturally. And so when I think about people going through puberty, I'm not just thinking about what those hormones are doing. I'm thinking about suddenly that social pressure and the body image issues. I'm thinking about how you might be busy at school and becoming involved in the family meal times and helping mum prepare foods and making decisions about food choices. All those things start to change. You start becoming independent. And so when we think about how nutrition needs change over the lifetime, we've got to think about not just what's happening physiologically within us, but also what's happening outside us that makes our behaviour around food change as well. And so it can be a time for increased nutritional requirements for females when they're going through puberty, but it's also a time when a lot of pressure around what you eat and how you eat and when you eat, and changing from that family routine to a self-chosen sort of independence. It's a really tricky stage. So many things are happening. So much information is being given to people. I was lucky when I went through puberty that I didn't have to worry about social media and Insta and all the things that currently are crowding.
Very complicated.
Yeah, it's such a complicated time to live. And we had a very narrow set of information sources and a narrow set of friends and family that might have been giving us some information about ourselves and helping us to form our own ideas. But now it's just open slather, isn't it? There's so many people with so much access to young girls going through puberty. It must be such a confusing time.
No, absolutely. I really like your holistic approach because I think it puts it in the context of what is the young woman or young girl feeling, thinking, doing. And I like also your description of kind of the practical application of it, because you can talk about nutrition in principle and conceptually, but if it doesn't fit into somebody's life, and particularly you think about teenage girls going through puberty where there's a lot going on, as you've described, from a social standpoint, in terms of their own self-image, trying to figure out who they are, right? It's a complicated time. So you throw nutrition on when their bodies are changing. I think it's really insightful how you describe taking that holistic approach. And I think what you describe also, it sounds like that's a good approach, or an approach at least that you've taken as you have helped and supported and researched women throughout their lives. So if we look at the next stage past puberty and we talk about women in their young adult lives, for many, this may be a time where they're starting to think about and planning for pregnancy or having children, or maybe not having children. And they're often modifying their diets or looking for specific supplements to help them prepare for this. What are some key considerations for nutrition at this time?
Well, we often tell people that there are certain nutrients that are very important in the very early stages of pregnancy, and folate is a good example of that. And when we have people who are planning pregnancies, we ask them to start taking a folate supplement or sometimes a multivitamin supplement prior to getting pregnant, so that their folate status and their general nutritional status is good at the time of conception. But there are a whole lot of people who become pregnant by accident or before they've had a chance to make the decision that this is what they want to do. And so it's never too late. And it's not just about the folate. I often, when I'm dealing with young girls, think about just the regularity of eating and making sensible decisions about alcohol and having a really good attitude about body and body image and weight and having all those things sorted out, just as well as the folate. If we can try and have other aspects of our nutrition and our perception of food sorted out so that when you go through pregnancy, and there's some parts of pregnancy that are challenging. Some people have great problems with morning sickness, and we need to think about how we manage nutrition around the times of the day where people feel well. But sometimes for a lot of young girls, the gaining of weight and the important parts of sustaining a pregnancy through the changing of the body and providing enough nutritional value to the baby as well as yourself, that can be quite confronting to people as they see their body change. And then in the post-pregnancy period, being able to sustain breastfeeding successfully and also just keeping up with your nutrition at a time when the baby's taking so much of your time and sometimes the lack of sleep and coping with all the other parts of the lifestyle that are challenging, the mother's often the last person to get looked after. So trying to find ways in which all those things can still fit into life, and food is an enjoyment, and it's all part of that great adventure of our lifetime that we accommodate changes and can move through those different phases.
How do you help women, particularly on, I'll call it sort of the psychological part of it, of the body image? There's so much change going on and there's so much nutrition that you need for yourself and to support this new life that's growing within you. And then after, you're thinking about, how do I lose the weight? We talked before about social media. All of those things create a bit of a soup for a lot of women. How do you help women think about that? Because there's the rational piece that you're describing, but then of course there's the emotional piece.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that I often talk to people about, just how there's two little voices in your head. There's the voice of reason and sanity and logic and science. And you can sit down and you can understand how important it is that your body will change, that there's two of you now that need to be eaten for. And it's not a time of wild abandon. I mean, sometimes some people get pregnant, they think, oh, I'm eating for two. So they eat far too much and they don't eat healthy things. They sort of indulge these cravings. So it's not saying just go crazy, but it's also saying there's needs that we have to take into account now for the baby and also to support the required weight gain. So we can talk about it from that sane point of view, the logical point of view, but it is also good to talk with people about, now let's talk about that other little voice, the crazy voice, the voice that's looking at all those Insta photos of stars that have had babies and gained nothing, and then half of whatever they gained, they've fixed it up in 4 weeks and they're back out on the catwalks again. I mean, that's completely unsustainable. And it's probably not even a truthful model of what those stars have done anyway. It's all been airbrushed and, the story's been changed to make it look miraculous. But trying to laugh at people and saying that little voice is there, we can't get rid of it, but we can learn to laugh at it and just say there's ways in which we can tone it down.
That's very good advice. Probably easier said than done for a lot of people, but I'm sure with enough coaching and practice, people are able to successfully implement that approach. So as we continue kind of down the aging process, I'll call it, then we start to talk about women who are in their 40s. What happens to women's bodies over time, and how does nutrition help them continue to live long and healthy, energetic lives? I think it's a commonly held belief that how you take care of yourself, your body, your exercise, your nutrition has an important impact on your overall health and how you age. And certainly the discussion now, I think, around, I'll call it lifespan, is not just about how many years, but the quality of years. And so how does nutrition play an important role, and how should women think about nutrition during this time?
It's an investment piece. So as you go through the adolescence and the early adulthood, this is where you've got to do the right thing, to lay down good bones, to have good muscle mass, to learn, healthy patterns around the way that you choose your food, have a good relationship with your physique and body fat. Because once we get to a certain age in life, it's very difficult to gain muscle mass, much easier to lose it. And we start losing our bone mass as well. And so the idea is that we try and build up the best bank, that best investment in ourselves as possible, and then try and reduce the rate of spending or losing it, if you like, over the next part. And it's never too late to take up things. My husband gave me a set of weights for my 50th birthday because I'm an endurance kind of athlete and it's much easier for me to feel like I want to go for a run. He says to me that if you make it to 50 and you haven't died of something related to a cardiac event, then you'll die of something related to loss of muscle mass. It'll be because you get frail and elderly and you fall over and you break your hip and your mobility and your ability to look after your nutrition reduces because of all those things, and you'll end up in the old age home with too much of a sedentary lifestyle. So muscle mass is really important, and it's one of the things that often people don't recognise when they look at their total body or their total weight. They just think about the kilos, and particularly with people who hit middle age and might think that they're needing to do something to be healthier and losing some weight, some body fat, often they'll embark on diets that reduce body mass, but a lot of it is muscle mass. And so we can end up with this problem called sarc obesity. That's what the medics call it, where the sarc is about the muscle mass loss and the obesity we know. But you can have people that don't even look as if they're overweight, but they have a very high proportion of body fat for the weight that they do have and very low muscle mass. And so people might think that they're healthy-ish because they're not obese, but they're heading for trouble because it's this lack of muscle mass and weak bones that make people very at risk of falling over and then of breaking bones when you do. And it's those things that really impact the quality of life later on. And you know what you said before about the longevity versus the quality of life. That's where the investment in muscle and bones becomes really important, because you want to be active elderly person.
Absolutely.
You want to be out there being able to walk and look after yourself and interact with people and not just sit away on a chair. That's all you can do, people coming to visit you.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your point before about a holistic approach, right? You lay that foundation so you can be active, you can be social, you can be independent, all of those things that I think we naturally value when we're younger, but maybe become a little more challenging as you get older if you're not laying that foundation for the muscle mass and your body strength as you described. So let's pivot now, and because I think that's a great foundation. Thank you for that. And talk a little bit about women's nutrition in athletic performance, where you have even more expertise.
Well, can I preface it by giving you a confession? And that is that I have been very derelict in my duties to female athletes over most of my life, it turns out. I've been reading articles for probably a decade now talking about the lack of females in sports science. And I thought that was meaning that there's not enough scientists that are women. But it's suddenly when I read the articles properly, I found out that there's not enough female athletes as participants in studies. It might be that they've got a different gut microbiome to males. There's just so many different things. It's all those unknown unknowns. And so we should, for the right reasons, go back and do some of those studies again. Now, I want to just also say that there's a little bit of a trend at the moment to say females have got to run their lives by their menstrual cycles, and that we can give a female advice at this stage of your menstrual cycle, you're more likely to be able to do this kind of exercise or eat this sort of food. And there's lots of apps and there's lots of people selling their services or their resources to help athletes say, I've got to eat differently or train differently at the different phases of my menstrual cycle. Now, I think we're just not at that stage where we could say that's true. And I don't think it will ever likely to be true for every athlete. When I work with female athletes, some of them find that their best performances come during their period. Some of them find that their worst performances happen then. Some of them find that they're more likely to have these kinds of interests in food or cravings for food at this time of their cycle. But it's so different. It's not one size fits all. I always hate when a little bit of science gets overhyped and over-marketed. Because, you know, I'm reading websites these days or apps and things that tell me that at this phase of my cycle, I'd be better at parallel parking than at another phase. And it's all kind of crazy stuff like that.
That crazy little voice again that we have to talk to.
That little voice again, yeah. But look, people are marketing it, and there's been a bit of publicity that the US soccer team won the last World Cup because they were basing their training and their diet around their menstrual phases. They may have become more aware of it, but really this idea that there's some sort of magic way of doing things on this day that you do differently from that day, I think that's really a hyped idea. But what we can do is work with individual athletes and help them learn about their own changes during the menstrual phases. And then there may be ways in which they could adapt what they do to better suit how they're feeling and how they're responding to things. So there's a little kernel of truth to it, but not so much that be rushing out now and saying, I have to do it this way or I have to do it that way. It's a bit like horoscopes. I think some people believe in them, that things are predestined based on something like that. But I think there's a little bit of science underpinning the idea of the menstrual phases, but not enough to be doing rate changes in how you're eating or thinking or training just based on which phase of the cycle you're in, for everybody doing it the same way.
I think that when I listen to you speak, I think that intuitively makes sense. And what I think a lot of people maybe don't understand or don't realize is how much happens behind the scenes in sports. All the support that athletes receive around nutrition from people such as yourself. What are some of the things that you've done to help prepare and provide this support? And maybe one step beyond that, because everything you just said is creating so many questions in my head. What I think would be interesting to hear about specifically is, how do you tailor your dietary strategies to the specific needs of different sports and each athlete? Because as you described, there's no one size fits all. There are probably some general nutrition principles and guidelines that are just physiological. But as you describe, it's that holistic approach and it's that very individualistic approach. So how does that work?
Well, I'd like to find out a lot about the athlete and their event. And as you said, it's partly physiological, partly understanding things like fuel requirements and hydration needs and recovery strategies around nutrition. So there's a lot of things that we can look at from a purely physiological point of view. I can think about all the different ways that athlete's going to put their training program together leading into a competition and try and wrap a nutrition strategy around every session, which then fits into the overall weekly lifestyle and then the month and then the year. But once we have those ideas put down in terms of nutrients or nutritional goals, then we have to find the food style and the eating patterns that athlete can manage and enjoy. So there's always more than one way of achieving the same nutritional goals from a meal. And I've got to think about what the athlete likes to eat, what they can afford to eat, if they're traveling or whether they're doing it at home, whether they're living in a university college or whether they're in a share house. So there's so many different things that you have to factor in of, this is what I'd like to do. This is the environment or the ecosystem that I'm doing it in. How can I manage to add those two things to integrate them together? And then I've got to think about the pleasure and the cultural and social aspects of eating, because it would be so boring if we just ate nutrients out of tubes just to get what we know the body needs. We eat food because we love it, and we eat food because we share it with other people, and we eat food because it's entertainment. And so we've got to find ways in which we can maintain the balance to have all those things happening at the same time as meeting nutritional goals. And so, look, when I was working at the AIS and I was doing all these different roles at the one time, some days I'd be in the lab doing some research, but then I'd be rushing off to do a cooking class to teach an athlete how to put a meal together. Or I'd be doing a supermarket scavenger hunt to teach an athlete how to go around the supermarket and find the things that fit into their nutrition plan. So there's so many different aspects of what you do to help people, partly by finding new knowledge and then partly by finding an application of it in their lifestyle, and then partly by teaching them the skills so that they can do it on their own. And then sometimes it's just about being a supporter or a mentor to the athlete. I really believe in placebo effects, that when an athlete feels confident that they've got a really good strategy and they've done everything that they can do to prepare them to be on the starting line, then they'll take all those science-based things and do them well, but there'll be that little bit of extra that goes on top of it because they're so confident and happy with what they're doing.
The secret sauce.
It is the secret sauce. So I don't mind selling that as long as there's the evidence-based.
The evidence-based secret sauce. I really like what you described, and again, this sort of holistic, tailored approach. I'm wondering if there's any kind of general guidance or advice that you might be able to give our listeners who are maybe more, I'll call them casual athletes, people who, work out on a regular or semi-regular basis to stay fit or kind of training for the next decades. Are there any guidelines or things that people, women in particular, should think about as they're thinking about their nutrition, whether it's particular supplements or nutrients? Again, knowing that it's going to differ by stage, but maybe just some general guidance.
Yeah, and I'm a recreational athlete, so I'm thinking about what I'm interested in, not what is going to win a gold medal. So the first thing you need to think about is making good use of the food that you eat so that you get the nutrient value and the right timing of that nutrient value around exercise. Some people have this funny idea that people exercise just so they can eat more junk food, that you deserve to eat it. Whereas I take it the other way around and say it's still important to have some food that you really enjoy in your life that may not have nutritional value. It's just there because you love it. But what you need to do is make most of what you eat have a contribution to the goals of the training and the health that needs to support you being able to keep training. So if people can take apart what they're trying to do, and if the goal is just to stay healthy and fit or to gain that muscle mass and keep your bones healthy just from a health perspective, then there's certainly ways that you can eat to support that as well, spreading protein over the day, having plenty of calcium. We're also looking at the timing of calcium intake, whether having some before you do some exercise could be a good way of helping with bone health, particularly in the sorts of exercise that don't have a lot of bone loading. So if you're walking and swimming or cycling, as opposed to doing running or something that's more weight bearing and putting pressure and mechanical loading on the bone, then you can perhaps help a little bit with the bone health by being more aware of calcium intake. We've also looked at what happens if you are trying to lose some weight, but trying to not lose muscle mass at the same time. And that's a little bit about doing resistance training, but also spreading protein over the day so that with every exercise session, resistance training that you're doing, you're trying to maximize the amount of muscle gain that you get from that session, because the effects last for probably 24 to 48 hours. Every exercise session that you do gives you a legacy of making your body better able to recover if you can get the right nutritional strategies to support it.
That's very interesting. I've made a few personal notes for myself here as well. I think one of the things that really resonated that you said is this whole virtuous cycle between what you eat, how you look at kind of the efficiency of the food that you're eating, and the relationship with exercise. And I think, and for me at least, if I'm eating healthy and I'm exercising, the two of them, each one kind of encourages me to continue doing the other. And it all just works really well. And then if you get out of the habit because you've been traveling or something, you got to get back into it, and then you start to feel better again. So as we continue talking about women's nutritional needs across the different ages or stages of life, let's talk a little bit about menopause and how does that change how women should think about and approach their nutrition?
If we take it from the physiological angle again, we have changes in hormonal patterns. So we're now going to be losing a lot of the estrogen that was a part of the menstrual cycle earlier in our life. And that does have some changes to the way we metabolize fuel, the way we use fats and carbohydrates, the way that we have our protein synthesis also involved. So it becomes more important to eat well. If we think not just about the physiology of what's happening during menopause, think about the lifestyle changes. It can be sometimes that slowing down when the kids have left home and the way that we eat is changing again. Sometimes it becomes that you don't bother so much. When the kids have gone and there's no need to have the family meal, sometimes we start cutting corners, or sometimes we eat food for comfort rather than all the things we used to be able to do as a family. So we've got to think about changing the sort of focus that we now need to eat more cleverly to be able to take into account that there's changing ways in which we're metabolizing or changing ways in which our bodies are doing their work. At the same time, it can be a time of decline in the way that we're eating in terms of the value of the food. So we've got to really think about how we can marry the things better together to be able to look after these extra things, but do it in a way that's still within our lifestyle and the social networks that we have and the enjoyment that food gives us. So it's a time of a lot of change. And again, it's a bit like the puberty. It's confronting because there's so much to have to take into account. There's a lot of acceptance that needs to go into the whole aging process. I sometimes joke, oh, gee, getting old sucks. I wish someone had told me and then I wouldn't have done it.
I think the alternative might be worse though, right?
But sometimes thinking about, yes, look, aging has got its disadvantages, but we can always do it as well as possible. And that's my goal. As I said, I'm a very recreational level runner, but I'm still doing it and I'm not getting as slow as other people. I'm trying to use all my smarts around nutrition and training. I'm slowing down less than everybody else.
You just have to run faster than the next person. That's all you got to do.
My goal is to win my age group at the New York City Marathon.
I love it.
Might take till I'm 80 till I've worn out the opposition, but I'm going to hang in there.
Hey, that is one strategy. No, I'll come cheer you on. So as we look into the future of nutrition, what research do you see happening in the next 5 to 10 years that could potentially change the way we think about nutrition for women? I know there are probably plenty of those big unanswered questions that either people have been chasing or as we learn one thing, we realize how much we don't know about something else.
Well, we're certainly going to go back and look at some of the things that we think are evidence-based now, based on male studies, and confirm that they work as well for females and see if there's any tweaking that might need to be taken into account. And it could be because of the menstrual phases, and it could be that there are some things that we might need to change over the phases or just change between males and females. But it could also be that it's just confirming things. And as I said before, around the placebo effect, that confidence factor, that when we can confirm that it really does work well for females, then we can add that extra little special sauce to the advice that we give females.
Louise, I feel like this conversation has been a bit of serendipity for me. I want to say thank you so much. What was a really interesting, inspiring, and thought-provoking discussion on women's nutrition across the ages. I have definitely learned a lot from speaking with you today. I'm sure our listeners have too. I'm not an athlete, but I think I may want to make some adjustments to my diet, nutrition, and workouts. Professor Louise Burke is an Australian sports dietitian, academic, and author. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't already done so, please rate, review, and subscribe to Nutrition Unlocked on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, so you can make sure you don't miss a single episode and you can let others know about it as well. We look forward to sharing more insights on the science behind nutrition soon. See you next time on Nutrition Unlocked.